Hello there. Welcome to the Subversive Radio Podcast. I'm your host, Keith Giles, and I want to first just apologize. It's been a very long time since I have attempted to record one of these, and it's been mostly because I haven't had the opportunity or even the access to my computer because I have two teenage boys who, and I only have really one computer between us. So that's been really hard. But then even a couple times I've tried to record the podcast and I've had technical difficulties and had to restart my computer multiple times and on and on and on. Anyway, finally, praise God. I'm not sure I want to call that spiritual warfare, but at any rate, all the barriers that had prevented me from recording a podcast have been removed, and here we go. So there's been something that, it's funny because I was wanting to talk about this topic. I was thinking about doing a podcast or a blog on this very issue a few days ago, and then almost immediately somebody posted something on Facebook which brought it up again, and then in my responding to it, the replies that I got from people online even further drove home to me the need to do a podcast on this topic. So here we go. So in the New Testament, Jesus gives us a very simple command, and it's love your neighbor as yourself. And I'm going to read it here from Matthew 22, verses 36 through 40, where Jesus is asked, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus' answer is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And he says, this is the first and the greatest commandment. And then he volunteers this last portion. He says, and the second greatest commandment is like the first. So it's this, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So I have heard many, many times when I teach on this or when I just quote this, Christians will come back to me and say, but if you don't love yourself, then how can you love your neighbor? So quickly, let me just address this issue. First of all, Jesus is not talking about self-esteem. Jesus is not saying you can't love your neighbor until you love yourself first. This is the way Christians in modern times, and especially in America, have paraphrased this verse. It has nothing to do with loving yourself. We have taken the command, love your neighbor as yourself, and made it about loving ourselves. That is not the point. That is not the issue. It has nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with your ability to love yourself. And I'm going to explain that in two ways. First of all, just in a very simple linguistic, logical way. Okay? Again, let's back it up. Someone asked Jesus, tell us the greatest command of all. Jesus says the greatest commandment in the law is this, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he says the second greatest command is like that one. It's like the command to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And it's this, love your neighbor. So loving your neighbor and loving God are connected. Nowhere in that conversation is there a discussion or an assumption that you must first learn to be really good at loving yourself. You must have a good opinion. No. You don't need that to love God. In other words, no one says, well, I can't love God until I first love myself. No, even though the second command and the first command are similar, these are the ways that they're similar. That if you say you love God but you don't love your brother, you're a liar. And if you say that you love your brother but you don't love God, those two things are connected. So the way that we love God is reflected in the way we love others, the way we love our neighbor, and the way we love our neighbor will reflect the way we love God. So if you say that you love God but you don't love your neighbor very well, that's a good indication that you really don't love God very much either. There are all kinds of scriptures in the New Testament that talk about this, like how if you see someone, it says in 1 John, if you see someone in need and you do nothing, how can the love of God be in you? Because again, it's pointing back to this idea that to love God and to love your neighbor are connected. James has a lot to say about this. 1 John has a lot to say about this. And here's the other way that I want to explain how Jesus' command here to love your neighbor as yourself has nothing to do with self-esteem. When Jesus quotes this, love your neighbor as yourself, he's actually quoting from Leviticus, okay? In Leviticus 19, there is a long series of commands where, for instance, God says, be sure to leave extra on your fields after the harvest so that the poor can come and glean from it. And he commands them, don't trip a blind man or mock or curse a deaf person. He says, be sure to pay your laborers on time. He says, rebuke your neighbor so you don't partake in their sin, etc. And so there's all kinds of commands about basically how you should treat others the way God wants you to treat people, okay? And then after all of these long list of things, it's the summary of all of that. Leaving extra in your fields for the poor, not mocking or don't trip blind people, don't curse or mock a deaf person, pay people on time, etc. At the end of all these lists is this summary command. So, love your neighbor as you love yourself. So that's what Jesus is referring to. Okay, he's actually quoting from Leviticus 19 when he answers the question, what is the greatest command? And then what is the second? And the second one he says is love your neighbor as yourself. And if you keep these two commands, if you are faithful to do these two things, to love God, to love your neighbor, you've kept all the commandments. Now, see, we want the out, right? We want it in America and in the West, in modern times. We want to say, but I'm not really good at loving myself, and so I can't keep that second command. Well, understand that if that's your excuse, that what you're doing is not only you disobeying God, you're disobeying Jesus, you're not being faithful to keep all the commands of God. Because God says, Jesus affirms, that you are simply to love God and love your neighbor. And if you're saying, I can't love my neighbor until I love myself, as if, well, first I need to go do another thing. And that thing, by the way, is loving myself. You've misunderstood it. Now, when I was having this conversation earlier this week, someone corrected me and said, well, it isn't about self-esteem. It isn't about all that. It isn't about pride. It isn't about all that. But it's about just, really, loving myself the way God loves me, etc. But still, that there is no but. There is no if in this command, love your neighbor as yourself. My good friend, Dr. Thomas Crisp, really did a wonderful job of encapsulating these commands in Leviticus 19 and Jesus' command to love your neighbor as yourself in something called the Shalom community. So in the Old Testament idea and the laws and the prophets and the Psalms, etc., there is, and especially contained in Leviticus 19, what we see there in all those series of commands is something that is expressed in what's known as the Shalom community. And essentially it's this. It's the idea that everyone in the community should be included in the Shalom or the peace community. So that, in other words, no one has real peace, no one truly has Shalom if only some of us have Shalom or peace. Or how it's expressed is that we have enough. So in the Shalom community, everyone has enough. In the Shalom community, the community has true peace, or true Shalom, when everyone has enough food and shelter and clothing and love. And the day that everyone is loved like that, then everyone has Shalom. Everyone truly has Shalom. So if we thought that we had Shalom, if we did our best and everyone in our community was fed and sheltered and clothed and welcomed and loved, and suddenly we realized that, there's a guy at the end of the street and he doesn't have food for tonight. Suddenly none of us has Shalom. None of us is truly a member of a Shalom, a peace community until we all go and make sure that guy has enough food. And the minute that guy has food and shelter and everything else that he needs, when everyone in the community has enough, then there is true shalom, there is true peace, and we have kept the command to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So when Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself, this is what he means by love. Okay, let me explain it in that context. When you think about yourself for a second, when you're hungry, just think about it. You're really, really hungry. Do you fix that? Do you go and make yourself a sandwich? Do you get in the car and drive over to Pizza Hut and order yourself a pizza? Do you get up from the couch and go into the kitchen and open the refrigerator and find something to eat? If you do those things when you are hungry, then do that. Be willing to do the same for the person that you see that isn't fed, that is hungry and doesn't have food. That's what Jesus means to love your neighbor as yourself. The loving yourself is, do you love yourself enough to get up and get yourself a sandwich when you're hungry? Then love your neighbor that much. Okay? That's the amount of love. That's the kind of love for yourself that Jesus is asking you to share with someone in need. When you're cold, say you're sitting around the house at night, and it's really, really cold and you're freezing, do you get up and get yourself a blanket, or do you get up and find yourself a nice warm sweater to put on? That's loving yourself. So if you see a neighbor, or you're aware of a neighbor that is cold and doesn't have clothing, doesn't have a blanket, doesn't have a warm sweater, then what Jesus wants you and I to do is to go and take that person a blanket, take that person a sweater, and make sure that person has the warmth that they need for the night. And if you do that, you've loved your neighbor the way you love yourself, because you would do that for yourself, wouldn't you? Of course you would. We all do it automatically. In fact, that's exactly what Jesus is wanting us to do, to have an automatic response. The same automatic response you have, I'm hungry, you get food. That when you realize my brother is hungry, my neighbor is hungry, you go and get food for them. The same automatic reaction you have, I'm cold, you automatically go and get a sweater or a blanket or something to make sure that you're warm. You're not cold anymore. To have that same automatic response, you go to the neighbor, to the person in the community that is cold, and you make sure that they're warm. So when Jesus says, love your neighbor as you love yourself, he means like that. Do you love yourself enough to feed yourself? Then guess what? You already love yourself enough to follow Jesus' commands, to love your neighbor as yourself. Do you love yourself enough to get yourself a blanket when you're cold? Guess what? You already love yourself enough to obey Jesus' commands to love your neighbor as you love yourself. That is what he means. It's not about, gosh, I just don't love myself enough. I'm just not good at loving myself the way I should. That has nothing to do with Jesus' commands, okay? I hope that explains it. Now, at the same time, I understand it's still a very real issue for a lot of people that, they have self-esteem issues. They really have these struggles that, I really don't like myself. And I look in the mirror, I don't like that guy. When I think about myself, I kind of don't like a lot of things. I start making lists in my mind of all the things about myself that I don't like. And so again, that can be a real thing. I get that. We can be depressed. We can have low self-esteem issues. I get that. First of all, I want to understand that's not what Jesus is talking about in that verse. But there are scriptures that do address this feeling and even gives us a prescription for how we can be healed from that and be restored from that feeling. The first one I would say would be to recognize that the God of the universe has already put a value on you. He's already said that you are worth dying for. That Jesus has already said he would rather die than live without you. That's what you're worth. That's your value to the creator of the universe, number one. Second of all, if you are struggling with these feelings, you feel like you need this inner healing, I want you to realize what Isaiah says in Isaiah 58. Isaiah 58 is talking about how the children of Israel used to fast. And there were very often in their culture called for them to fast in very, very religious ways, at certain times of the year, and observing different feasts and festivals. Fasting was part of that process religiously. And he was rebuking them for the way they were going about it. And he said instead, God says in Isaiah, this is the kind of fasting I want from my people. That instead of just not eating your bread for a day, I would rather you take your bread that you're not eating because you're fasting and take it to the home of someone who is hungry. Or go to those who are homeless on the street and take that food that you were going to eat and give it to them. And God says that when you do that, he says, Isaiah 58, verses 6 through 9, he says, when you do that, he says, then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly, and your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Now, get the idea, you're completely surrounded by the glory of God. And then he says, you shall call, and the Lord will answer, and you shall cry, and he will say, here I am. Now, continuing in Isaiah 58, verses 10 through 12, he says this, if you pour yourself out for the hungry, and if you satisfy the desires of the afflicted, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your gloom will be as the noonday sun. And the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your desire in scorched places, and make your bones strong, and you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters do not fail. So once again, do you see this? The idea that, well, I can't love my neighbor as I love myself because I don't love myself enough. Not only is that not what Jesus is talking about, in Isaiah, God specifically says, if you think, woe is me, I've got all these problems, I've got all these troubles, I've got all these issues, I can't do that. God in Isaiah says to us, if that's your issue, I still want you to take your food and give it to the hungry. I still want you to feed the poor. Okay? So Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. And what he means is, when they're hungry, feed them, right? When they're thirsty, give them something to drink. When they're cold, give them something to be warm. Okay? But God in Isaiah 58 says the same thing. He says, I want you to go ahead even when you feel like you're down, even if you feel like you're in trouble, even if you feel like your soul is downcast. Go ahead and take your food and give it to the poor, and feed the hungry, feed the poor, care for those who are in need, bless those who don't have as much as you have, and then your light will rise in the darkness, and then your gloom will shine, will change into the noonday sun, and then the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your desires and bless you. So either way, the answer that God has to this objection or to this argument that I don't love myself enough, and is to realize, no, you know what? Actually, you have what you need. There are others who have much worse problems than you. And when you learn to love others, guess what? You will learn to love yourself. You will realize that you are loved in abundant ways. And you know what? That is the truth. It really is true. Go and go volunteer. You feel yourself down in the dumps and you're not feeling, like you have the self-esteem that you need. Go and serve the poor. Go and care for those in need. You know what? Your heart will be lifted. Your spirits will be blessed. You'll receive a bigger blessing than you bring to people in need. That's a beautiful truth. It really is true. So once again, Christians, when you hear Jesus say to love your neighbor as yourself, understand it's not about you. And all that's required of you is to go ahead and love people, and go ahead and give to those who are in need. Go ahead and take the extra that you have and give it to those who don't have enough, and make sure everyone has enough. And when we do that, we're blessed and they're blessed, and we have fulfilled the command to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And I think that I'm going to let it let that be it for today. And thank you for listening. And I will hopefully podcast again soon because there are several things I still want to talk about. And hopefully we'll get to that coming up. Thanks for listening. God bless, and let the kingdom come.